Long ago in Norway, there lived a rich landowner, a squire, who had acres and acres of land, dozens of barns and outbuildings, and everything one could ask except for a family. He got thinking to himself, well, I was so busy when I was young making my fortune, I didn't have time to look for women. But now that I'm older, I guess I have plenty of time. So he began walking through his grounds, looking at the women who were servants there at his farms and outbuildings. And he saw one woman there that took his fancy. She was half of his age, but he figured, everyone says yes to me. So he walked up to her and said, you know, I was thinking to myself, perhaps it would be a good time for marriage. The young woman, who was using a hay fork to move some hay into the loft, said, oh, well, that's a nice thought to be having, but aren't you just a little bit old to be talking about this with women half your age? No, 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 he said. It's the sort of thing that everybody does, young and old. Besides, I think you are the right woman for me. And he smiled at her, thinking his smile would make him more attractive. The young woman looked at the rich squire, and though he had lots of money, there were other parts of him that she was not in favor of. No, thank you. You should look for someone else. I'm sure lots of people here would love to marry you. And she turned and went back to her work. Each day, the squire would make a special trip down to where this young woman worked. And he'd give her a gift. Sometimes a piece of fruit, sometimes a piece of lace. She thanked him kindly for the fruit and the lace, but she was very careful to make sure there was no ring hidden somewhere in the gifts. After days and weeks of trying to do the best that he could to court this young woman who would have nothing to do with him, the squire thought, well, clearly the woman is too young to know what's good for her. I'll go talk to her father. This was back in the days where some people thought that fathers knew what was best for their daughters. And while that might be true in some cases, arranged marriages, maybe not the best thing. At least not in Norway. He walked up to the father and said, good man, I see you work a small piece of land here at the edge of my holdings. Now, should we become relatives, I would be happy to give you 5 bags of gold and the richest part of my farm to have as your own. But of course, that would require your daughter to say yes to my proposal of marriage. The father, he was a clever man, and he had a clever daughter. And he looked at the squire and he said, you can ask her. But if she says no, that's the way it is. Now the squire was fuming. No one said no to him, and no one told him they couldn't do what he wanted them to do. So he thought and thought of what he could do to trick this woman into marrying him. And one day, he came up with a plan. He went back to the woman's father and said, all the things are prepared. I think your daughter only needs to see how well I will care for her, and then she'll be more than happy to be my bride. So I shall invite the guests and bring the parson and set out a large feast and decorate my buildings for the wedding. We'll get married right in my great hall. You just make sure that when I send someone for your daughter, you send her along. Are we agreed? The father looked at the squire and said, well, if she says yes to going up to your house, and says yes to marrying you, that's entirely her affair. But if someone comes to get her, I'll let them know where she is. Now the day soon came. The invitations were set out to all the influential people in the village. But they were very careful to make sure no one who knew the young woman knew of the wedding. And the day came, and it was the young woman's day off, so she was at her family farm. The squire got dressed up in his fanciest clothes. His servants set out chairs in the great hall in his house. The musicians began tuning up their instruments. The parson was ready to hold the wedding. And the squire sent one of his workmen. Go down to the farmer at the edge of the valley. Go tell him it's time that you send what was promised. Tell him that and hurry it up. Okay, 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 said the young workman. And he ran down the hill and ran to the farm and, still breathing hard, knocked on the door. The farmer came to the door and said, yes. The squire up on the hill, he says, he sent me to come for what was promised. Oh. Well, go ahead and get her. She's out in the hayfield, said the farmer. The workman ran out to the hayfield, and there he saw Mary tossing the hay. He ran up to Mary and said, I've come from the squire on the hill. He says it's time that you send what was promised. Really? Said Mary, looking just a little confused. Ah, I know what it is. My father probably promised him the old bay mare, the horse right down there. Why don't you ride it back to the squire? She smiled, knowing full well that wasn't likely to be the truth. The workman ran over as fast as he could, jumped on the horse, and rode it all the way to the squire's house, tied it up behind the house by the back door. Still sweating from his running and his riding, the workman walked into the house and met the squire. Is she upstairs now? Well, no, sir, she's by the back door. Well, get her inside right away. Get her up to the bedroom up there, and I'll tell the servant girls what to do next. But are you sure, sir? Sir, I mean, she's a... Get her up there now, said the squire, with a yell that no one dared disobey. So the workman got a lot of the hands from the barns, and they began pushing and shoving and dragging, and finally got that mare into the house, and up the back stairway and into the bedroom. In the bedroom were laid out a wedding dress, and a beautiful veil, and a beautiful, beautiful, round garnet of flowers to wear on her head. The squire sent the servant girls up there and said, she's up in the room right now. Go get her into the dress and get her all ready for the ceremony. And the servant girls went up and saw the horse. I thought this was rather odd. A wedding, and we're dressing a horse in a dress, but they were told to do that, so they did what they were told. They dressed the horse in the dress, and the squire was looking around. It was time for the ceremony to begin. The musicians were beginning to play, and he looked around. He didn't see Mary anywhere, and so he went to that workman who had brought the horse, although he didn't know it was a horse. He said, go upstairs and bring her down right now. But sir, it'll be very difficult. Now! Shouted the squire. And so the young man went, again with all the farm hands. And as the crowd was seated in their seats, the music was playing, and suddenly there was a huge racket on the stairs as they saw a horse coming down the stairs dressed in a wedding dress with flowers in its hair and a veil across its face. And the people, they just burst out laughing, and the squire, he looked at that horse, and he realized what had happened. And they say they laughed about that in the town for weeks. And that squire, he never went courting again. And that's the end of the story.